What would you do? If you were standing between 300 Apache warriors and 20 white ranchers with itchy trigger fingers, and all it took was one bullet for the world around you to burn, would you hide? Would you run? Or would you climb a 30-foot water tower, carrying the bloodied son of a chief on your back and raise a photograph to the sky, hoping it meant something to someone? That was the choice Thaddeus Whitmore had to make. And it started not with war, but with mercy. Just 12 hours earlier, Thaddeus wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't trying to save anyone. He was just another bitter, broken rancher with a wooden leg and too many ghosts. A man who'd seen too much war and not enough peace. But when he heard the gunshots echo through Eagles Canyon, he did something no one else in that territory would have done. He got on his horse and rode toward the danger. There, half buried in red dust, was a dying Apache warrior, young barely more than a boy, and shot through 3 times. Everyone would have told Thaddeus to walk away. Heck, most would have told him to fire a 4th shot just to be sure. But what Thaddeus did next would set off a chain of events that nearly destroyed everything he'd ever known. Because that boy, he wasn't just any Apache. He was the son of Chief Running Elk, the very man who, at that very moment, was preparing to ride into peace talks. And when that son didn't show up, the chief came for answers, with 300 warriors and fire in his heart. This is the story of one photograph, one wounded boy, and one man who dared to believe that mercy might just be stronger than hate. So stay with me, because sometimes peace doesn't start in a war room. It starts in a ranch house. With a choice. The Arizona sky was turning copper when Thaddeus Whitmore heard the gunshots, sharp, frantic, and wrong. Not the kind you heard from hunters or rowdy drunkards. These were desperate, and spaced out just enough to sound like a fight someone was losing. Most men would have bolted the door and pretended they didn't hear, especially men like Thaddeus. He wasn't known for softness. Folks in town said the war had taken his leg, and with it every tender part of him. He didn't argue. He had a wooden stump, a half-dead cattle business, and a cabin full of silence. That was all the world had left him after Gettysburg. And if there was one group he had no sympathy for, it was the Apache. He'd seen too many friends gutted in ambushes, too many settlers burned out of their homes, and somewhere along the line, hatred had become easier to carry than grief. So when he followed those shots into Eagles Canyon, he didn't know what he was looking for. Maybe closure, maybe trouble. What he didn't expect was the boy. Face down in the dirt, blood soaked through his buckskin shirt. 3 wounds, maybe 4, hard to tell under the dust and crimson. He looked no older than 20, just a kid. Thaddeus could have left right then, could have watched that boy bleed into the canyon floor and told himself it was justice. But then, the boy opened his eyes, not in fear, not in hate, but with a strange calmness, like he already knew this man. This bitter, limping stranger was the only chance he had left. And then through cracked lips and with blood bubbling from his chest, the boy spoke one word. Please. It wasn't a war cry. It wasn't defiance. Just the kind of plea that levels you, the kind that reaches into the part of you you thought was long dead. Thaddeus stood frozen. All those years of rage, of prejudice, of pain, and still here he was, staring down at someone his country called an enemy, and seeing painfully the face of every young soldier who'd ever died in his arms. He didn't speak, just knelt slowly, holstered his rifle, and lifted the boy onto his saddle. The ride back to the ranch was a mile, maybe 2, but it felt longer than any battlefield Thaddeus had ever crossed. Every rustle in the brush felt like the breath before an arrow, every echo like an omen. But he got the boy home, laid him on his own bed, took off the bloody shirt, and started to patch what he could. He hadn't even asked the kid's name yet. All he knew was that the bleeding wouldn't stop, and somewhere someone would be looking for this boy, someone who might not be as interested in mercy. And as he leaned over the cot to check the dressing, something slipped from around the boy's neck. A small leather pouch, inside a faded photograph. And that's when everything changed. Thaddeus had seen blood before, More than he could count, more than he could forget. But this was different. There was something about watching a boy fight for breath in your own bed that stripped away every layer of armor a man like Thaddeus built up over years of grief and grit. The Apache youth, barely conscious skin, waxy from blood loss, murmured incoherently in a language Thaddeus didn't understand, fever rising with the dawn. Thaddeus worked by lamplight hands, steady in spite of the tremble in his chest. He cut away the boy's buckskin shirt, careful not to disturb the deeper wounds, and reached for clean water to rinse the blood. That's when his fingers brushed the small pouch slung around the young man's neck, worn leather tied with a frayed string. Thaddeus hesitated, then opened it. Inside was something he hadn't expected to find, not a weapon or a token of revenge, just a photograph. It was cracked old, the edges curled like dried leaves, but the image was clear enough. A white woman, maybe in her 30s, stood with her hand resting gently on the shoulder of a boy, no older than 8. A boy with long black hair dressed in simple Apache garb. They were both smiling, not posed, not forced, just at peace. It stopped Thaddeus cold. For a long moment he simply stared, the sounds of the desert morning fading behind the hum of memory. He'd seen pictures like that before. Not often, not proudly displayed, but enough to know what it meant. This boy wasn't just Apache. He wasn't just a raider caught in the crossfire of an old war. He was someone caught between two worlds, just like Thaddeus had once been. A half-white, half-native child, raised perhaps to speak 2 tongues, to walk 2 trails, and now lying half-dead in a rancher's bed because neither side had made room for someone like him. Thaddeus swallowed hard, the air in the cabin, suddenly too thick. Was this why the boy had looked at him with recognition? Why his plea for help had felt like more than desperation, more like trust? He set the photograph gently on the bedside table beside a half-used bandage and the empty tin of boiled water. The boy stirred slightly, his brow twitching but didn't wake. And then Thaddeus heard it, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Drums. Not the thunder of hoofbeats or the casual beat of ranch hands at work. These were steady, deep, ceremonial, death drums. He stepped to the window, heart in his throat. Far off across the rising heat waves of the desert came the sound of 3 short beats, then 4 long ones, then silence. He'd heard that rhythm before, a long time ago, on the banks of the Colorado River, and it never meant peace. He turned back toward the boy. He still didn't know his name, but now he was certain of one thing: someone was coming, and they weren't coming to thank him. There are sounds a man never forgets. The echo of rifle fire across canyon walls, the gurgled last words of a friend bleeding out beside you, the soft clink of a wedding ring in the palm of a dying soldier. But for Thaddeus Whitmore, it was the drums, 3 short, 4 long. Then silence, over and over again, steady, relentless, the rhythm of loss, of mourning, but not the kind that asks for sympathy, the kind that comes with vengeance. He stood at the window, shoulders squared but spirit shaking. The desert stretched out in every direction, quiet and golden. But the drums bled through the earth like a warning, a call not just to gather, but to grieve, to rise. He didn't need anyone to tell him what it meant. Somewhere out there, Chief Running Elk, leader of the White Mountain Apache, had just learned that his son was missing, maybe presumed dead. And he was gathering his warriors not to ask questions, but to make someone answer. Thaddeus stepped back from the window and looked at the young man on his bed. The boy's breathing was shallow but steady, his skin still pale. Fever clung to his brow like sweat. So young, so still, and so terribly important. Not just a son, a symbol. If he died here in the home of a white rancher, it wouldn't matter that Thaddeus had tried to save him. The story would twist like wildfire through the camps. A betrayal, a trick, a peace envoy gunned down before talks could begin. The kind of story that started wars. Thaddeus ran a hand through his hair and limped to the porch. He sat on the steps and stared out across the sand toward the far horizon, toward the echo of those drums. And for the first time in years, he felt something he thought the war had burned out of him completely: fear. Not for his life. He'd made peace with that a long time ago. But for the life of the boy inside. For the town of good men who wouldn't understand soon enough. For the peace that might be lost before it had the chance to breathe. The sun was barely above the hills, but the heat was already rising. Somewhere in the haze, dust clouds would form soon. Riders, armed, angry, heartbroken. Grief like that doesn't ride alone. It rides with fire and arrows and teeth clenched so tight they turn into legend. Behind him, the boy stirred. And for the first time, he spoke in something close to English. 2 words. "My father?" Thaddeus turned, but the boy had already slipped back into fevered sleep. It was then he knew. This wasn't just about mercy anymore. It was about fate. By the time the sun climbed higher, the desert wasn't quiet anymore. The drums still echoed in the distance, slower now. More ominous. The kind of rhythm that makes even the wind hold its breath. Thaddeus Whitmore stood with his back against the porch post, rifle by his side, as the day began to unravel around him. To the south, dark silhouettes broke through the haze. Apache riders, dozens of them, moving in unison like a wave of history turned flesh and fury. To the east, another dust cloud rose, horses charging faster and rougher. White men this time. His neighbors. Led by Sheriff Dalton, their rifles strapped tight, their minds already filled with fear and fire. And somewhere behind the canyons, he knew he felt the soldiers were watching. Everything, but understanding nothing. 3 forces, 3 stories each, sure of their truth. Each one armed with reasons. And all of them headed straight for him. It would have been almost laughable if it weren't so terrifying. A half-broken rancher, a fevered boy, and a cabin too small to hold all that anger. Thaddeus looked down at his hands, still stained with the boy's blood, still shaking from more than just fear. He hadn't been this close to war in years, not since Gettysburg, not since the cannons fell silent, but the screams kept echoing in his bones. And yet, here it was again, not with battalions and banners, but with dust and heartbeat. Inside, the boy stirred. "I must speak." He rasped his words, clumsy but desperate. "They think I'm dead." Thaddeus moved to his side. "You need to rest." But the boy gripped his arm, surprising him with the strength of it. "If my father thinks whites kill me, he will burn every settlement from here to Tucson." Thaddeus closed his eyes. The boy wasn't exaggerating. He was Running Bear's son of Chief Running Elk. And this ranch, this moment, had become the spark that could ignite everything. Out the window, he saw the sheriff's men coming in from the east, kicking up dust, already drawing weapons. To the south, Apache riders fanned into a crescent formation. They were both preparing for a fight. No one knew the boy was alive. No one knew he'd been shot by someone else. Maybe bandits, maybe a soldier who fired too soon. And no one was interested in waiting long enough to find out. It was all going to collapse. Any minute now. Unless someone did something impossible. Thaddeus Whitmore had always lived his life trying to stay out of sight. After the war, after the limp and the nightmares and the silence that settled over him like dust, he'd built his ranch to be just far enough from the world to forget it. But now the world had come to him, and staying invisible was no longer an option. Inside the cabin, Running Bear lay pale and trembling, one hand curled around the worn photograph of his mother and himself. The only proof that something other than hatred had once lived between white and native. The only thing that might speak louder than bullets. Outside, the cavalry's bugle had fallen silent, replaced by the electric stillness before violence. On the other side of the ridge, the Apache warriors had stopped moving too. Waiting, watching, 1,000 rifles and arrows trained on this patch of land. This cabin, this moment. Thaddeus stood at the window, his heart pounding not from fear, but from clarity. He couldn't outrun what was coming, but maybe he could meet it head on. "There's no time to ride," he muttered more to himself than anyone. No time for words carried across battle lines. He turned to Running Bear. "You said your father gave you this photograph?" The boy nodded weakly. "He'll recognize it from afar." Another nod. Thaddeus looked out again, this time at the water tower. 30 feet tall, center of the field, no protection, no cover. But it could be seen by everyone. "You think they'll shoot, Running Bear?" asked his voice thin. Thaddeus gave a half-smile, grim and resigned. I'd be shocked if they didn't. For a long moment, neither man said a word. Then Thaddeus picked up the photograph, smoothed its curled edges with surprising gentleness, and pressed it into the boy's palm. "You hold this," he said, "high as you can. I'll get you to the top." Running Bear's eyes widened. "You'll climb with me?" Thaddeus nodded. "I won't let you fall." The wind picked up, carrying the weight of history with it. The war drums were gone now, replaced by something heavier. Silence filled with intent. And two men, one scarred by war, the other by heritage, stepped out into that silence. Step by step across the no-man's land of prairie. Step by step toward a wooden tower that might become a grave. Step by step. Because sometimes the only way to stop a war is to show up where everyone can see you. They began to climb one behind the other, pain and fear in every breath. But higher with each rung, closer to the light, closer to being understood. 30 feet above the dust and rifles, Thaddeus and Running Bear stood trembling on the narrow platform of the water tower. Below them, 3 armies waited, none fully understanding what they were seeing. Guns were still raised, arrows still notched. But in Running Bear's hand was the only weapon they had, a faded photograph, and behind the sun-creased glass, a woman's smile. Her name had been Sarah Mackenzie, a teacher from St. Louis who came west chasing purpose, not glory. She taught children to read Apache and white alike, and she taught them, perhaps more importantly, how to see each other. She had married Chief Running Elk against everyone's wishes and died too young from fever. But before she left this world, she gave it something rare, a boy who spoke 2 languages, who belonged to 2 nations, and who believed that kindness could survive even here, in a land where hate had roots deeper than any tree. That boy now stood swaying on a tower, blood drying on his skin, holding his mother's photograph like it was armor. And maybe it was. Chief Running Elk had ridden to the front of his warrior's eyes, squinting up into the glare. When he saw the image, the woman he had loved, and the son he thought dead, his war-painted face crumbled, not with weakness, but with memory. He dismounted slowly, staring upward, and the desert seemed to hold its breath. Colonel Hayes, too, approached on horseback, field glasses trained on the tower. His men, trained to kill at command, stood frozen, confused. What kind of standoff had a photograph at its center? From atop the tower, Running Bear raised his voice. "My father," he said at once in Apache, then again in English, louder. "I live. I am safe." It wasn't a military maneuver. It wasn't a strategy. It was a son's cry, simple, human, and filled with more power than all the guns below. And suddenly, things began to change. Thaddeus could see it. Shoulders dropping, hands lowering, murmurs rippling through both lines. The photograph had done what no treaty ever could, because it didn't ask for agreement. It simply asked people to remember that before blood and land and history, there had once been a woman. One woman, who believed in love. And her love, caught in celluloid and memory, had just reached across a battlefield. Thaddeus looked to Running Bear, whose strength was fading fast. "You did it," he whispered. But down below, not everyone had been ready for peace. A voice rose, angry, trembling. Sheriff Dalton, eyes wild, rifle raised. "That Apache murdered my brother." And just like that, the moment threatened to shatter. Peace is never born with a shout. It begins as a whisper. One voice, one gesture, one photograph held aloft in trembling hands. But a whisper can be drowned out by just one scream. And that scream came from Sheriff Marcus Dalton. "That Apache killed my brother," he shouted, stepping out from the ranch house, rifle raised, eyes burning with rage that had no room left for reason. "I don't care what he says, what he holds in his hand. This is a trick. Just another way to get close and slit our throats." Thaddeus froze. Running Bear turned his pale face toward the sound. And below, every warrior's bowstring tightened, every cavalry rifle subtly shifted its aim. It took only seconds for everything they had risked to start unraveling. Sheriff Dalton wasn't evil. He was wounded. Like so many men of the West, he carried loss like a brand burned into bone. His brother had been ambushed during a cattle drive last spring, scalped, left in the dust. No one had claimed responsibility, but grief never needs facts. It only needs a face to blame. And in that moment, Running Bear's was the face. "Lower your weapon," Colonel Hayes barked, galloping into view. "That's an order." But Dalton didn't hear him. Or maybe he did, and just didn't care. Hatred had made him deaf, the kind of deafness born of long nights staring into the dark, asking why him and not me. Chief Running Elk tensed, stepping toward the man who threatened his only son. His warriors followed. There was no strategy now, only instinct, heartbreak, and the thin, crackling edge of chaos. But then, something happened. Running Bear, swaying atop the tower, lifted his voice once more. It was hoarse, broken, but clear. "If you kill for your brother, then I must kill for my mother. If you carry your pain, I carry mine." He held the photograph, higher sunlight flashing across its surface. She believed in peace, in people, in both of you. Sheriff Dalton's arms dropped an inch. Colonel Hayes moved his horse between them. And Chief Running Elk stepped forward slowly, his hands empty. "I know the boy who killed your kin," he said, his English heavy but careful. "He broke my command, and I will bring him to you. Justice, not revenge." Dalton stared, chest-heaving, lips quivering between old fury and some deeper sorrow. No one spoke. Even the wind stilled. And finally, the rifle lowered. That moment didn't feel triumphant. It felt tired, like a long-held breath finally exhaled. Thaddeus gripped the railing of the water tower tighter. He looked to the horizon, where another dust cloud began to rise. More riders. The dust cloud rose like a storm on the edge of the world. To Thaddeus Whitmore's eyes, now weary from squinting into sun and chaos, it looked like a promise written in sand, a promise that peace had come too late. The Mescalero warband was coming fast. Over 100 riders painted for battle arrows, glinting war cries already echoing faintly on the wind. They hadn't seen the water tower. They hadn't seen the photograph. They hadn't heard the fragile words that had stopped the first battle from igniting. They'd only heard the drums, seen the smoke, felt the call to vengeance. Running Bear slumped beside him on the platform, stirred faintly, his lips dry and pale. They think peace is broken. And if they hit the cavalry line before anyone explains otherwise, Thaddeus didn't finish the sentence. They both knew. It would be over before it began. Below, Chief Running Elk mounted his horse again, urgency burning in every motion. Colonel Hayes shouted orders to his men, trying to buy time to prepare for defense instead of assault. Sheriff Dalton just stood still, rifle now slack in his grip, like a man realizing he'd only just started to believe in peace, and already it was slipping through his hands. Thaddeus climbed down legs, trembling boots, hitting dirt with a thud heavier than the fall of any bullet. He looked around. At the ranch he'd built to keep the world out. At the boy he'd almost let die. At the old enemies now standing shoulder to shoulder, bound together by a single act of mercy. And he said almost to no one, "There has to be a way." Running Bear coughed from above. "They will only stop for my father. He's already riding out," Thaddeus said. "But they're not slowing." Running Bear was quiet for a long moment. Then his eyes, barely open, locked with Thaddeus's. "Then I ride too. You can't even stand." "I must," Thaddeus wanted to argue. Every instinct screamed to protect him, to shield him from the madness of what they were about to attempt. But the boy's voice, frail as it was, held something stronger than logic. It held belief. They saddled 2 horses, one for Chief Running Elk, one for Colonel Hayes. And in the middle of the battlefield, they would ride together, Apache and cavalry, ancient enemies side by side, toward the oncoming war. It was madness. It was suicide. But it was also the only chance left. As the Mescalero riders crested the final ridge, weapons raised and howls piercing the morning, Thaddeus gritted his teeth and hoisted Running Bear onto the saddle. "We ride now," he said. "For peace," Running Bear whispered. They rode like ghosts against the morning sun. Chief Running Elk and Colonel Hayes, 2 old warriors weathered by time and war, led the charge, not with swords, not with rifles, but with their presence. And between them, swaying in the saddle, bleeding through his shirt, but eyes still burning with purpose, was Running Bear. Behind them, Thaddeus watched with a heart pounding like a drum that hadn't decided if it was calling for battle or prayer. The Mescalero war band thundered forward, dust clouds in their wake, war cries sharpening like flint against bone. They hadn't come to listen. They hadn't come to see. They'd come because they thought peace had died. Thaddeus held his breath as the three riders moved into the path of those who hadn't yet seen the photograph, hadn't heard the truth, hadn't believed that a white man could save an Apache boy without wanting something in return. And for a terrifying heartbeat, it didn't work. The Mescalero didn't slow, not until Running Bear lifted the photograph. From horseback, he held it high, the same image that had stopped 300 warriors now. Flapping wildly in the desert wind, his mother's smile dancing in sunlight, her hand on the shoulder of a boy born from two worlds. And this time he didn't whisper. He shouted, in Apache. Words full of history of blood and grief, but also of memory of what she had taught him. What he had seen in the cabin of a man who could have left him to die, but didn't. Thaddeus couldn't understand the words, but he felt them. So did the Mescalero. One rider broke away from the group and galloped toward them. The war leader, a man with eyes sharp as obsidian and the weight of generations in his voice. He pulled his horse to a stop before Running Bear and looked at the photograph. Silence fell, then a single nod. The war leader raised his hand. His riders slowed, weapons lowered. The ceasefire held, just barely, but it held. Chief Running Elk dismounted and lifted his son down from the saddle with arms both trembling and strong. "You saved them," he said in English, wanting the colonel and the rancher to hear. "You saved us all." Running Bear managed a weak smile before his knees gave out. Thaddeus ran forward, catching him just before he hit the earth. And as he knelt there, supporting the weight of a boy who had become something more than a bridge, he heard the war drums fade, not into silence, but into stillness. Not all the wounds had healed. Not all the anger had left, but for the first time in a long time, nobody was reaching for a weapon. That in itself was a miracle. The war drums never beat again in that valley. 3 weeks later, Thaddeus Whitmore sat on his porch boots up on the railing, a fresh cup of coffee in his hand. The Arizona wind was warm that morning, softer somehow, as if even the desert had exhaled. Running Bear was resting inside the house. His wounds were healing slower than anyone would like, but he was walking again, helping stack fence posts, even laughing once or twice when the pain allowed. Chief Running Elk still visited every few days, not with weapons, but with smoked meat, medicine herbs, and long silences that meant more than words ever could. Colonel Hayes had returned to the fort with the signed treaty tucked under his coat. But before he left, he shook Thaddeus's hand with both of his own and said something neither man would ever forget. "You didn't just save your ranch. You saved all of us from forgetting who we are when fear takes over." Even Sheriff Dalton had come around slowly, cautiously. He'd brought his injured deputy by one afternoon to thank the Apache healer who had saved the boy's arm. No apologies were spoken, but a man like Dalton showing up at all was the apology. One morning, a group of Mescalero children wandered onto the ranch, chasing prairie birds and laughing so hard the cattle looked up confused by the sound. Thaddeus didn't chase them off. He brought them apples instead. And when their parents came riding in after them, nervous and unsure, they found the porch already crowded with white folks and Apache alike sharing shade bread and quiet understanding. Thaddeus smiled, then a deep, quiet smile that came from the kind of peace you don't find in treaties, only in people. He looked over at the photograph now framed above his fireplace. A white woman and her Apache son, her hand on his shoulder, a promise in her eyes that love could outlast war. They were neighbors now, not by law, but by choice. And as the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting golden light across the porch floorboards, Thaddeus leaned back and whispered, "She was right. Your mother, she was right all along. If you believe that one act of kindness can change the course of history, if you believe courage isn't just about drawing a gun, but about standing still when others rush to hate, Then subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the American frontier, true, emotional, unforgettable. Click on the video on your screen now for another powerful story, this time about a child, a blanket, and the warriors who came to return a debt paid in compassion. Thank you for watching, and thank you for still believing in the quiet power of good people.